In terms of the questions I'm often asked about property, the two ones I'm asked the most about the UK property market is A, what's the cheapest point you can really get in for a decent rental yield? It might not be the kind of place you would want to live in, but what would be a kind of a minimum starting point? And also, in terms of the process, I know you talked about the mortgages, but of course it depends on many things. What's your job? And of course, risk has to be assessed for mortgages. But would you say it's a fairly simple process when it comes to the how-tos? Is it literally just introducing to a mortgage provider? And most of the time it's fairly straightforward, unless somebody's in a very high-risk country. Maybe they're in the embassy of oil and gas in Iraq, then it might be a bit more difficult. But in general, it's fairly simple. What would you say about that from your experience of helping out clients?
That's a great question. Yes, with the mortgage side, I think it is actually a lot more straightforward than people think. As you mentioned, it does come down to different individual people and their background, but generally how it works, the largest source of mortgaging for UK properties at the moment is actually UK banks looking to lend to overseas investors because they want to increase their exposure. They're looking at getting more business. So what they would typically do, there's big kind of macro things they consider. So there's two separate ways they go about assessing the transaction, if you will. One such way is purely the property. So they'll look at the property separately, and then they look at the client. So when they look at the client, the main things they're looking for are either they're currently employed or they have a stable source of income. Strangely enough, that with the way it works in the UK, because the markets we work in, people don't actually ever have to put money into their mortgage. The tenant who's living in the property will pay it. However, to get the mortgage, the bank will normally do a risk assessment on the client just to ensure that worst case scenario, the client's in a position where they can cover 1 month's rent if they can't have a tenant in the property. So they'll look normally at your position. They will look generally at your 3-month bank statement, and then just assess whether or not they're comfortable lending to you. Again, certain banks have a bigger risk appetite. So that's kind of it. And generally, the reason I say that it is quite straightforward. I think a lot of banks, not to kind of go too deep into the advice, but a lot of banks will look for kind of a minimum income of around 25 to 30,000 US dollars a year from the clients, and then they do their assessments on the property separately.
How can I help you? In 2 ways. First of all, are you an expat, a high net wealth individual, or just somebody who lives in a part of the world where it's difficult to get access to quality investment solutions? In which case, go onto my website on adamfayed.com and find out more. If you don't fit into any of those categories, then in which case there's a range of free material on my website, on this YouTube channel, and indeed on my Quora, where I get over 200 or have received over 231 million views in the last few years. And finally, if you want to actually read my thoughts in more detail, go onto Amazon and find my book on there.